Before we talk about bans and restrictions, it's worth clearing away the conspiracy framing that usually surrounds this topic. Governments rarely restrict tools because they're evil or magical. They restrict them because tools change power relationships. When a simple object allows ordinary people to hunt, move, communicate, or resist control without infrastructure, authorities take notice. History shows that some survival tools were limited, regulated, or outright banned, not because they failed, but because they worked too reliably outside centralized systems. Start with edge tools. Large knives, machetes, and short swords have been regulated repeatedly across history, especially in urban centers and occupied territories. In medieval Europe, laws limited blade length among civilians. In colonial regions, indigenous populations were often prohibited from carrying long blades. The issue wasn't crime rates alone. A long blade is a complete survival system. It processes food, builds shelter, defends territory, and requires no ammunition or supply chain. When authorities wanted populations dependent on centralized protection and provisioning, limiting blades was an obvious step. From a survival perspective, this explains why compact, versatile blades persisted in rural and frontier regions long after cities abandoned them. Crossbows provide another revealing case. Medieval bans on crossbows weren't about battlefield ethics alone. Crossbows allowed untrained individuals to defeat armored elites. They flattened the skill curve. A peasant with a crossbow could kill a knight who spent a lifetime training. That made centralized military power harder to control. Crossbows were also excellent hunting tools that didn't require years of archery practice. When governments restricted them, they were restricting self-sufficiency as much as violence. The survival lesson is that tools that lower training barriers tend to attract regulation. Firearms followed a similar pattern later, but even before modern gun laws, restrictions often focused on portability and concealment rather than raw power. Short-barreled weapons, easily hidden arms, and improvised firearms were targeted because they allowed individuals to operate independently of formal forces. Historically, long muskets were tolerated longer than pistols because they were less practical for daily carry. Survival tools that integrate seamlessly into everyday life tend to be viewed as more threatening to centralized authority. Trapping equipment has also been quietly restricted in many regions. Steel leg-hold traps, snares, and certain netting methods are banned or heavily regulated in parts of the world. While conservation is often cited, history shows these tools were restricted first where populations were expected to rely on markets rather than subsistence. Traps work continuously without supervision. They allow food acquisition while the user performs other tasks. From a survival standpoint, that efficiency is priceless. From a control standpoint, it's problematic. A population that feeds itself quietly is harder to pressure. Maps and navigation tools were once restricted as well. Accurate maps were treated as military secrets for centuries. Even civilian access to detailed charts was limited in many empires. Knowing terrain meant freedom of movement. It meant evasion, trade, and coordination beyond official routes. In modern terms, GPS made navigation universal, but historical restrictions remind us that spatial knowledge itself is a survival tool. The skill to navigate without permission has always been politically sensitive. Radios and communication devices offer a more recent example. Shortwave radios were restricted or monitored in multiple countries during the 20th century, not because radios were weapons, but because they allowed information flow beyond borders. Communication is survival. It allows coordination, warning, and adaptation. Governments understood that populations able to communicate independently were harder to isolate or control. Even today, emergency communication tools are sometimes regulated under broadcasting laws, not survival statutes. Lockpicking tools, they sit in this sort of grey area that really reveals another layer. These tools are legal for professionals, but, well, they're restricted for civilians in many places. Historically, knowing how to bypass locks wasn't just about crime, it was actually about access. Locked storage, buildings, and infrastructure tend to concentrate resources, a population capable of accessing them independently that really disrupts that concentration. In survival contexts, lock bypassing can mean shelter, warmth, or medical supplies. Authorities usually focus on intent, but if you look back, history shows the concern was always about capability. Even simple medical tools have, at times, faced restriction. During certain periods, herbal medicine, midwifery tools, and medical knowledge outside sanctioned institutions were actually limited or even criminalized. These weren't ineffective practices, by the way. They were effective without oversight. Centralized medicine increased standardization, sure, but it also reduced local autonomy. For survivalists, this really highlights why decentralized medical knowledge has always been quietly discouraged when institutions sought control. It's important to emphasize that restriction doesn't automatically mean unjust. Societies balance safety, order, and freedom differently over time. But the pattern, honestly, is pretty consistent. Tools that allow individuals to meet basic needs independently, quietly, and reliably tend to attract attention from authority structures. For modern survivalists and historians, the takeaway isn't defiance, it's understanding. When you're evaluating a tool's value, ask whether it functions without supply chains, permissions, or infrastructure. Ask whether it lowers the skill barrier to self-sufficiency. Tools that score highly on those measures tend to be the same ones history tried to contain. Survival has never been just about wilderness. It's about autonomy under pressure. The tools governments restricted because they work too well are reminders that resilience has always been as political as it is practical. Understanding that history doesn't make you dangerous, it makes you realistic. If you value survival knowledge grounded in history rather than hype, go ahead and subscribe to Strange History and share this with someone who thinks restrictions only happen when tools fail.